through public events like this one, reading groups, writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. We run a kids read program that offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with a first novel prize and our Emerging Writer Fellowship. So visit our site, follow us on social media. If you like what you see, come back and see us soon. For example, tickets are on sale now for the First Novel Fete, which is one of our favorite traditions here at the center. We celebrate the 7 authors shortlisted for our First Novel Prize throughout the building, open house, 300 people, open bar. It's a real blast, and that'll be on Friday, December the 6th, and I'd love for you all to come. So for tonight, a few logistics. After the talk, we will have an audience Q&A. And if you're here in the room, do raise your hand so that one of our wonderful interns can bring you a mic. Please do use the mic so that any guests on the live stream can hear you. And for those of you joining on the live stream, please add your questions to the chat. We're not doing a signing tonight, so when the event is over, make your way to the bookstore and purchase your copy of Peggy, and those have all been pre-signed by Leslie Jamison, so thank Leslie for that. And to introduce the main event, a tribute to the work of Rebecca Godfrey. In 2019, we had the honor of hosting Godfrey on this stage for an insightful panel about adolescent girls, a topic she explored in her acclaimed true crime investigation, Under the Bridge. Tonight, we're honored to celebrate Rebecca's final novel, Peggy, with her friend Megan Abbott, her editor, David Ebhershof, and the dear friend who helped finish Rebecca's novel, Leslie Jamison. You're likely already familiar with those wonderful writers, but just to acknowledge their accomplishments briefly, Megan Abbott is the Edgar Award-winning author of 11 crime novels, most recently Beware the Woman. David is the vice president and editor-in-chief of Hogarth, as well as the author of The Danish Girl, and Leslie is the author of the Empathy Exams, The Recovering, the novel The Gin Closet, and the memoir Splinters. Please join me in welcoming Megan, David, and Leslie to the stage.
Thank you. Lida, thank you so much, and to the Center of Fiction, I want to thank you for hosting us tonight, and everyone for being here. It's a really bittersweet event for all of us, I think, and even just hearing now that Rebecca was on this very stage talking about a subject that was very central to her work, evening I wish I had been at. But we're really happy to have a chance to talk about her final book, Peggy, and her. So I want to thank Leslie and Megan for being here tonight. I thought to start, we would just each say a little bit about our own connection to Rebecca and how we knew her. So Megan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, we met, I think it was 2005. I realized after that we had about 4 people in common that were trying to put us together, but it turned out to be the editor of my first book, Denise Roy, was the editor of Under the Bridge, Rebecca's book, and she knew based on editing both those books that we should meet because we were both writing about complicated females, I guess I would say, and I've written a lot about teenage girls, and so we both already had so much in common, and then we increasingly did, and became great friends after that. Under the Bridge is really, to me, the best true crime book ever written, and I go back to it often.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear about your connections, plural, to Rebecca, because I think she inspired that kind of reaction, like people, because that was how we originally came together too. It's like a number of former students of both of ours just had this feeling that we should know each other, and they were right. Rebecca and I taught together at the Columbia MFA program, which is where I still teach, and Initially, it was some beloved students, the remarkable writer Madeline Lucas, one of them, who brought us together, and then we became friends more recently in 2019. I actually was at that. I was glad that they brought up that event, because I was at that event in 2019. I remember it was this amazing conversation. It was right around the same time that Rebecca and I were doing an interview with, I was interviewing Rebecca for the Paris Review about Under the Bridge for the reissue. And so it was incredible to hear her in person speaking about that remarkable book as we were starting to dig into it. So Rebecca and I, became friends in that kind of fast, furious, hungry way that when you find somebody that you're like meant to know in the world, you're like, okay, where have you been? How can we connect on every possible level? She was already sick, so it was also just there. She didn't know how much time she had, and so I think we were just hungry to know each other. And I loved her as a writer. I loved her as a mother. I loved her as a kindred spirit. She just anybody who knew her knew that she had just such a remarkable, lively, smart, funny, beautiful way of being in the world. So that was the beginning.
For me, we crossed paths at Columbia where I taught and she taught, but I didn't know her well. And then in 2022, I became her editor for this book. And I recall when that happened, her previous editor had left and I took over. She and I had a very long telephone call, about 3 hours, maybe even longer, in which she told me what she wanted for this book and what she hoped for, what she had been doing for many years in writing this book, and what she hoped to see in its final version. But really, my way of knowing Rebecca is the way that I think most writers want to be known, which is on the page, in reading her work and reading the draft and the draft that you worked on, which we'll talk about, and just really looking closely at her language, her ideas, her energy, her intelligence, her love of detail. Like when she found a good detail, she really shared it with us. And getting to know Rebecca Godfrey, the writer, that way is how I know of her and why I'm here tonight. And it's a special way to know a writer. Always being an editor is a privilege, but in this particular case, it is especially so. I thought for this conversation, we might start talking about the book, Peggy and Peggy Guggenheim, and begin where Rebecca begins. The very beginning of the book, she quotes Peggy Guggenheim with 3 amazing words. "I adore floating," Peggy Guggenheim said. So I would love to know from both of you, what does this quote mean to you, and why do you think Rebecca begins there? Megan, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember when Rebecca first started talking about this book, but I don't remember when it wasn't in her head. And one the sort of, I guess, the implicit project of it was this woman that we think we know in a very specific and narrow way, and defined mostly by her money, and I guess slightly nasty undertones often to it. And as someone who is all exterior, no interior, and to me that phrase already brings you inside into something interior and emotional and complex and lyrical, and just sort of, it's the perfect example. I think Rebecca always did this with all of her characters, real or imaginary. She could just pierce right through to the center and find, and with such love. And I think wanting to start with that, which I don't think any other writer in the world would, seems so her to me.
Yeah, I love that. So many of those thoughts resonate for me around Peggy and Rebecca's particular, very singular, I think, vision of Peggy, or what she saw in Peggy and what she built for Peggy as a character on the page. But I Adore Floating, to me, takes an aspect of Peggy's character that does live in the cultural imagination, maybe that she was a bit of a dilettante, or that there was something kind of light about her, and torques that conception in an interesting way, because it actually takes like a sort of floaty energy and turns it into this determined, emphatic claiming of like, yes, I adore floating. And there was something, to me, one of the aspects of Peggy's character that I love in Rebecca's manuscript is that she's so emphatic about claiming her connection to all kinds of beauty, to the kinds of beauty that are widely understood as profound, but also to beauties that other people might find trivial. There's something about this like kind of passionate conviction with which she embraces, delight, like kind of well-made things, like so there's and then pretty quickly in the book we get to Peggy's fascination with the fact that her father is building these elevators that can go right up the Eiffel Tower, and so I Adore Floating starts to take on this other layer, which is like Peggy was really drawn, the character of Peggy was really drawn to larger than life figures, people whose minds and imaginations weren't circumscribed by the proximate or the actual or the earthbound or the
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things it just struck me now as you were talking, that Deanna Arbus, when you read about her, and she sort of grew up and not as privileged as Peggy Guggenheim, of course, but a very privileged but very cosseted and emotionally empty sort of. There was a sense that she was anchored and suppressed and like trapped like a little girl in a frilly dress somehow. And the idea, I Adore Floating, suggests having found some kind of freedom and a refusal to be stuck in any one place ever again or something. There's something in that. It's so rich.
And Rebecca chose to write this in the first person, and so for me, as her editor, this quotation is stating that, is saying we're gonna have a story told from her point of view, in her voice, and with an aliveness that actually captures who she was. And she was many things. I mean, she was an heiress, a daughter, a sister, a mother, a curator, an art. I mean, she was an artist in many, many senses. I would love for you to expand on sort of how you think of Peggy Guggenheim, both the person that we might know, the persona, but also Rebecca's particular depiction of Peggy Guggenheim.
Well, and it's interesting that you bring up the first person. I think this is a way into your question. I mean, part of the ambition of writing a novel about Peggy Guggenheim is that she does loom so large in the kind of collective cultural imagination. There are, at least 2 major biographies out there of her, and she published her own memoirs not once, but 3 times. So there's and the history of those different versions is itself an interesting story, but the first one is a little bit sex forward, the second one is much more art forward. But one thing that's true about her, I love Peggy Guggenheim's memoirs, but they are not particularly interior, and so I think there's a way that those memoirs actually kind of throw down an interesting challenge or a gauntlet to an artist, and especially, as you were saying, Megan, about Rebecca's work, that she does pierce into her characters, whether they are real or imagined. That I think there was a part of her that was both interested in artifice, interested in the surfaces of Peggy Guggenheim's life, the objects she surrounded herself with, the artist studios that she found herself in, the artwork she collected and was drawn to and kind of preserved, the the beautiful places where she wanted to put her body, but she was always deeply interested in the kind of conflicting emotional forces that lived inside of Peggy. And so there was a way that she was sort of taking this figure who many people understood almost exclusively in terms of her surfaces, her moneyed surfaces, her glamorous surfaces, and finding all this richness inside. And I think some of the tensions that feel most important to me in Rebecca's construction of Peggy as a character are, yes, absolutely what you were talking about, Megan, this sort of tension between the world she grew up in and a very different world she wanted to seek out and inhabit, a world of artists, makers, people who were kind of reimagining the world and expressing it according to their own singular vision. I think she was torn between a sort of hunger for connection and certain difficulties that made her sort of stay in motion. I think she was torn or kind of doubly fueled maybe by her commitment to her vocation, this vocation that she found of sort of supporting artists, identifying their work, showing their work to the world, but also her life as a mother. And I think that kind of relationship between a commitment to vocation and a commitment to mothering was really moving to Rebecca and something that she wanted to explore. So there were all these kind of emotional knots that I think compelled her in Peggy as she imagined her.
Yes, it's reminding me of a scene that struck me because my experience of Peggy Guggenheim as a cultural figure mostly came backwards through reading artists and writers' biographies. So all these artists she supported, and it was always about getting money from Peggy, and it was so transactional, and it was, and there's a scene in the novel that just fascinated me. It's the scene with Juno Barnes, where Juno Barnes is being supported by Peggy, but things aren't quite to her liking when she arrives there, and it's like there's a sense of like a little bit of a hustle on Juno Barnes' part, and this like little dance they're doing, and you read it and you feel sorry for Peggy. She's definitely, Juno Barnes is a genius, but she's definitely being hustled, and and this is she's in her younger stage, and it's just the kind of naughty thing that Rebecca was so good at getting around, that this is a dance they're doing of sorts, but Peggy's new to it and Juno Barnes is not. And it's just sort of fascinating, and just the kind of thing the book does so well.
Well, and absolutely to your point, I'm also thinking a little bit about some of the scenes in the novel between Peggy and Emma Goldman, who's also another figure who she provided fascinatingly financial support to. But the way that Rebecca is able to imagine these scenes that are about money, and also, that it's like it's not just about money or not about money. I think we're sort of attached to these notions of purity, like either a relationship is transactional or it's not, when of course like all of our relationships are just differently transactional, which I don't mean in a cynical way. No. I mean in a way that transactionality lives alongside other emotional registers in really interesting ways. So seeing, I think in a more meaningful way maybe between Emma Goldman and Peggy later in the book, but this way that it's about money, but there is also this feeling of real affection, a kind of kindred spirit. It gives an occasion for Peggy to sort of reckon with some guilt about her own she's basically like, we're the people you hate, right? But there's also a deep affection between these two women. So I like that way that money is ever present on the page, but it's not blocking other things entirely out of the frame.
Yeah.
For me, my sort of, when I first think of Peggy Guggenheim, I think of her home in Venice on the Grand Canal, which is now a museum and many people visit, and I have, and you see it, you're seeing her after the fact. This is when she's Peggy Guggenheim, the icon. You see the collection she's put together. You see all the artists that she identified when they were not famous and were not collected, and she helped put a spotlight on their talents. And then when you go to that museum, you see a Jackson Pollock and you see Alexander Calder headboard, and those artists are now sort of fixed in terms of how we think of them. But what the book does, and what I think Rebecca was really interested in exploring, is this idea of one woman having an eye and a point of view and an intelligence to see the world and see beauty in many different forms before others do. And I think the book is, in part, sort of, Peggy Guggenheim as a figure, and also as the center of this book, is an idea about beauty and elevating that. And that can often, particularly in Peggy Guggenheim's day, sort of been something, the word beauty could be dismissed as something of the feminine realm, and elevating it to the highest form and making a life out of it, not just a career, not just a transactional, but a life.
Right.
And that home represents that. I want to ask both of you about biographical or historical fiction. And it's a genre that can be as great as anything we've read. I'm thinking of Hilary Mantel and her books about Thomas Cromwell. But it's also a genre that has traps. Overly heavy research, costumes, and I'd like to get your insight into how Rebecca avoids those traps and how she uses the actual story to write a work of literary art.
There are a lot of traps. I'm just thinking, because I have this two-person book club, and we only read biographies or memoirs of writers or other people in the arts. So we read a lot of them, and I feel like I've seen all the problems. And one of the main ones, and this is the one that clearly there wasn't a chance in hell that Rebecca would fall for this, is that they stop loving their subject the more they write it. And this is like a classic thing. They have there's a famous, I think it's a Colette biography where she hated her so much, the biographer, by the end, that you can't decide, do I hate Colette or do I hate this biographer? But they're because of the in some ways you're finding out everything about someone is finding out everything about everyone, and you're going to find all these things that you don't like, that that aren't pleasant or hard to wrap your mind around, or you can feel like you're doing this dance with the subject. And I guess this sort of using the novel in this very specific way, that number one is clearly the history of it, that you feel the era in the small details, but it's so lightly done. It feels so light on its feet when it's handling the passage of time, or even there's something even and it's in part about modernism, the part of the book the part of her life that this covers. It has that kind of feeling of this great sort of fractured narrative where we move from place to place. And you never for a moment feel that she has anything but love for Peggy. And that just sort of hums through the whole book. And I think gives it this life that a lot of both biographies and historical novels, that especially ones that are writing about famous people, don't have. They don't have that lightness.
Yeah, I think a couple of things in there chime so much with my sense of what gives there's a way that the historical fiction can feel just so encumbered. It can feel as if it's wearing, as you said, a kind of costume or a heavy garment, or like something upholstered or something like that. And I think Rebecca's prose is a big part of it. I mean, just the nature of her sentences, which are, as you say, quite light on their feet and often have a propulsive, sort of breathless rhythm to it. Doesn't feel like anything is dragging, or being like its hem is dragging on the ground, like weighted down by all its research. Everything is moving. Everything is drawn to these sources of heat and trouble and mischief and misbehavior, and so I feel like there's something about her prose that's just constantly energetic in a way that pushes back against some of those textural or energetic traps. And then I think she was one of the things that she was really drawn to in Peggy and really emphasized in her conception of her character was a kind of a wryness, a sharpness, a tonal edge that also keeps the text from ever feeling sort of proper or dutiful, or a bit like kind of stiff or heavy-handed in the way that I think sometimes historical fiction can. And so the fact that Peggy is always witty, and she's always sort of, sometimes she's like pushing against the thing that somebody wants to hear, or she's saying something kind of sexy or flirty, all of these are kind of engines in the text as well.
Right. I remember when I was talking to Rebecca, she said that she did not want anyone who reads her book or hears about her book to think of Peggy as the kooky heiress. And that was sort of a long time reputation that I'm sure others put on Guggenheim because of the sunglasses and because of the money and because she was a woman. And so the other thing that I think Rebecca does well is that she has such a strong point of view on her life, as we've been talking about, and that a woman who was dismissed throughout much of her life until she was undismissible, Rebecca takes very seriously, and she's reinterpreted her life in a very feminist lens and very contemporary lens. And for me, that's one reason why the novel reads so of today, even though it's of another era. And I think that's also something that historical or biographical fiction needs to do. It needs to connect to us today. There needs to be a reason for a writer. A writer would have to have a very compelling reason to look back, and it has something to do with where that writer is in their own era. So Leslie, I want to talk about sort of the process of bringing this book to publication. I know all of us wish we were in the audience and listening to Rebecca talk about her own book. That would be an absolute delight. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. Can you tell us how you came to the project and what you understood it to be and the process of finishing this novel?
Just so deeply feel what you just articulated, that just every stage of watching this book come into the world, its beautiful cover, the kind of tremendous ways critics have engaged with it. It feels so double-edged getting to do this event tonight, because it feels like, yes, like this is what I want for this book and for Rebecca's vision, for it to be read and seen and given the beautiful material body it deserves. And it's almost like the better that feeling is, the deeper it cuts, because it's like, yes, and I wish she was here to see this cover, and I wish she was here to read this review, and I wish she was here and we were all listening to her. And that double-edged feeling was not one that I really had a word or a language for before this process. Herb, Rebecca's husband, and Christy Fletcher, her agent, I both had a clear sense of Rebecca's wishes, which is that if she died before the manuscript was completed, that she wanted it finished. She didn't want it published in a partial form. And I think that was like really a gift that she left to everybody, to be very clear about that, so that there was no sense of trying to suss out like which way she would have wanted it. And when they approached me to ask whether I might think about taking that on, I guess I felt grateful for her clarity on that front, because I think if she hadn't been clear about wanting it finished, I think I would have, of course, had all these misgivings about, well, all these feelings of like, I just don't want to displace any of the her in this book with myself, right? But I think knowing that it was what she would have wanted for the book to be finished in some way made it feel not like, didn't make the task any less daunting, but it offered a different kind of energy and momentum to coming to it, to think, okay, this is, there are not many things that we can do for people who are gone, and this felt like something that at least I could try. And there were many, many people in Rebecca's life who had many more conversations over a much longer time with her about this book than I was able to have. But I did have, we had some conversations that will stay with me forever in her hospital room near the end of her life about what she wanted this book to be, and specifically what she wanted the unwritten third movement of this book to be. So the book is in 3 parts: Old Masters. Remind me of the names of the parts. Sorry, Old Masters, Modernism.
Yeah, and then.
Sorry.
We worked on it last year.
I know. No, but anyway, the third part is about the first part is Peggy's childhood. The second part begins with her movement to Paris and documents her kind of tumultuous marriage and her years in Paris, Bohemia, the dissolution of her marriage. And the third part, and this was the part that was unwritten, although Rebecca had talked a lot about her wishes for this part and had dictated a number of pages and maybe written even some of them, had dictated some of them to Herb. So there was quite a bit of material about what she wanted this third section to be. But the kind of 2 DNA strands of the third section were Peggy opening her first gallery in London in 1938, Guggenheim June, and Peggy's brief but fascinating, tempestuous, and in Rebecca's mind, very important love affair with Samuel Beckett. Yet another instance of sort of what you were describing earlier. Peggy seeing something, so kind of like seeing genius before the entire world had seen it. Right now we hear Samuel Beckett, and we hear Samuel Beckett. But Peggy had a love affair with him when he was still Joyce's amanuensis, and before the rest of the world had seen and recognized. So it was that love affair and Peggy opening her gallery that Rebecca understood as a sort of 2 intertwining strands of this third section of the book. That I remember the phrase she used with me during one of our conversations was a section of the book that would give a kind of closing beat that would give Peggy some bliss and triumph. So I felt like the process of sort of working with first of all just like the tremendous and substantive 200 odd manuscript that Rebecca left behind, as well as these kind of richly layered pages and intentions that she had left to work with. There was so much there to kind of keep sussing out and carrying out her vision, and it felt like this deeply collaborative process the whole time. There was sort of Herb sharing this massive collection of files, manuscripts in various iterations, these pages she had dictated for the third section near the end of her life. Her dear friend Janet Johnson had a really helpful vision of how Rebecca had envisioned this kind of final coda for the book, which takes us to the Peggy you were describing, the Peggy in her palazzo in Venice. So I felt like I was sort of a vessel or a conduit, of course, primarily channeling Rebecca's vision for the book, but also all of these materials and resources and apprehensions of her vision that other people, even closer to her than I was, they could sort of funnel them into me, and I could try to bring it all together.
I have to confess, when you turned in the manuscript to Christy, to myself, and I found myself lost in it, I could not track where Rebecca left off and where you began. I lost all sense of 2 writers working on this, and I had a really sense of this as a very unified book, very unified voice. And could you tell us a little bit more about how you prepared yourself to do that, not just to enter the voice of Peggy Guggenheim, but also Rebecca's voice of Peggy Guggenheim, both your technical preparation, but also, if you would, your emotional preparation?
Yeah. I would say stage 1 was just a lot of reading and absorbing. So, reading, as I said, this like quite long, substantive, glorious manuscript that Rebecca left behind. And various parts of the book were in various stages of sort of completedness, but the part 1 was in a form that was nearly done. And so there was and then part 2, there was a tremendous amount of part 2 there, and it was wonderful. There were scenes. This is sort of fascinating on process level. There were different scenes where you could sort of see that Rebecca was choosing between 2 versions of a scene or 2 ways that it might two ways you might get into the scene or two ways it might end. So I sort of started by just immersing in the manuscript left behind. And then I did a sort of secondary set of reading that pointed in two directions. And one was reading Mary Dearborn's biography of Peggy Guggenheim that Rebecca was working with quite closely, Francine Prose's biography of Peggy Guggenheim for the Yale Jewish Live series, all three of Peggy's memoirs. I did that Peggy reading, but then I also went back and reread Rebecca's first two books, Under the Bridge and Girl with a Torn Skirt. And not because I was trying to I think that Rebecca's voice changes in interesting ways across her books. So it wasn't that I wanted to bring the voice from her first novel into her second novel sort of wholesale, but I wanted to just get as deep as I could into Rebecca's sensibility and kind of track these themes that I saw moving between and across her works, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But so I sort of did a deep dive into Peggy and a deep dive into Rebecca.
Right.
And then I went on some journeys. At this point, you can sort of see that there was an immersion happening and also maybe some postponement of there was a lot of immersion. I was also terrified to sort of turn the corner and start changing things in the draft. That felt like a very scary precipice to me. I was afraid of, I don't know, becoming a kind of invasive species or something, like one of those kinds of carp or something that's like eating the wrong things and taking up too much space and breeding too much. And I wanted to leave as much untouched as I could. So I also, I went to Paris and Venice, which were the two main places where the unwritten material took place, in part because part of what I also appreciate and love so much about Rebecca's prose is what you were describing earlier, her eye for strange and striking and sharp details. And so I felt that one of the best ways I could kind of conjure that sort of texture would be, because often her writing is visceral and embodied in ways that draw on the worlds that those bodies inhabit. So I went on those, I went to those places. I used some research money from Columbia, which felt like, what would Columbia want to support more than this project of hers? And then I had to, and in Venice I purposefully wanted to take myself kind of far away from my own life, and I had these like 5 days where I could do that, because I needed to have some sort of, I don't know, I don't want to use like woo-woo spiritual language around it, but I needed to get into some other way of being that was different from who I was in my day-to-day life, and try to channel, not necessarily a spirit, but really channel the voice that was emerging in those first hundreds of pages and just like see it through. So I actually did really the bulk of that work in Venice, kind of like talking to no one in this hermit-like state. I visited Peggy's palazzo a few times and just tried to kind of drink it in. But always when I was like, walking through the cemetery where Peggy and Beckett had gone on walks, or sort of trying to feel the way the heat came off of the Grand Canal at her palazzo, there was this kind of, I thought of it as like a Russian nesting doll kind of speculation, because when I was in those places, I wasn't trying to think, what would Peggy be thinking here? I was trying to think, what would Rebecca be thinking Peggy would be thinking here? Which is obviously impossible, but also a different kind of acrobatic task. But there was something about the triangle of the three of us that ended up also having this kind of uncanny energy to me, that I tried to kind of track and follow.
You did a phenomenal job. You gave the book the ending it deserves. Megan, why do you think Rebecca was so drawn to Peggy Guggenheim? Where do you think their lives might have overlapped?
Boy, I mean, I guess it's sort of in this sort of string of that. She and I talked about these women, these kinds of women all the time. Real, complex, messy, emotional women who in some ways just defied all expectations of their life, whatever version of it is, and bristled against any social strictures, whether purposely or sort of being, in And Under the Bridge, it's a little more complex because of the socioeconomic situation you're dealing with there. I mean, in some ways, it's the opposite of Peggy Guggenheim, but it's the same sort of women who don't fit and who don't do the things they're supposed to do, feel the things they're supposed to feel. I mean, Peggy's passion in her love relationships is so. I mean, you have to imagine a little bit about that era to feel so how against the grain she is for a woman raised in the way she was raised, and the sort of the slightly self-destructive qualities of some of her relationships, certainly her abusive first husband, all that stuff, all these things that just can't be accommodated together. They don't fit together. These women where the pieces don't fit together, which is really all women, as we know. But I just don't think anyone was better than Rebecca at making all these contradictions seem like a living, breathing, vibrant whole. And that feels like another through line. And to what you were saying about like the things that she would pluck out of perhaps the biography, she's sort of the real life details. It feels like she's always got the right detail, which is something that's true in Under the Bridge too. Like that isn't there something with the abusive first husband where he's like smearing jam in her hair, and it's like that's the thing when you read, like that's the detail you have to put in because it's someone whose rage is so out of control that they're just that their destruction, it's actually much more fearful than him waving a gun or something. And like those are the kinds of things that details that I can think of Rebecca reading that and just knowing that was going to be in the book because that was a piece of Peggy. So I'm sort of rambling now, but all these things feel true of, this is true in Torn Skirt too, that these are women that just don't fit. And therefore, I know I identify with, I know she did, I'm sure you do, and we're all sort of drawn to these women together and want to honor them.
I should say, just on that note, one of the ways that I knew about Rebecca before I ever met her was through this iconic seminar that she taught at Columbia called Anti-Heroines.
Yes,
there's just
I
like
remember that. Yes.
There's a whole kind of crew, some anti-heroines, alumni in the crowd. It was just a tremendously meaningful class for so many students. But one of the reasons I think it was so meaningful was that it kind of not only was that class invested in reading deeply into exactly these kinds of complicated female characters you're describing, but also really Rebecca was so invested in mentorship and in kind of making room for her students to write the kind of messy, unruly, unlikable female characters that they needed to write. And Peggy is like, such a consummate, wondrous, glittering kind of bag of glass shards, anti-heroine in her own right.
What were some of the books? Do you recall? Does anyone recall? Well, we'll
maybe some. Let's give some. Yeah. I think there was definitely some Bronte and some Reese, but maybe others can fill in.
So maybe one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience. And this is about motherhood. And Peggy is a mother. Peggy Guggenheim is a mother in the book. I would love your insight into Rebecca's insight into motherhood and being a mother.
I mean, I guess the place that my mind goes first is that, Rebecca was just so devoted to her beautiful daughter, Ada, who's right here in the front row. And, the experience of being a mother was so meaningful and fascinating and rich and just revelatory to her. And I only got to have a fraction of the conversations with her about motherhood that I wish we'd gotten to have. But even from those, I felt the intensity of her attention and curiosity and just this kind of awestruck feeling. So I guess that's one thing I want to say, is that I think her experience of motherhood was about giving, of course, but it was also about learning and being inspired and kind of like learning from her daughter. And like, it felt like she was so there was so much coming to her from the experience as well. And I think sometimes, when people have a sort of top-down understanding of kids where the kids are learning or the kids aren't the teachers or something, it was so antithetical to how I think Rebecca, just how much she absorbed and was curious about this like person that her daughter was becoming. And I think that she, I as I was saying earlier, I think that part of what she was drawn to in Peggy was, a sort of like deep cut of Peggy condescension that's out there. Maybe not the first dismissive thing people think about Peggy Guggenheim, but somewhere in there is that she was just a bit of a negligent mother, like farming her kids off to nannies and boarding schools. And there was, biographically, like there was a bit of that. And some of that was a function of maybe class and just her social world and how she herself had been raised. But there was also a deep care and attention, for example, Peggy Guggenheim's daughter, who died quite tragically when she was young, was also a beautiful artist. Mm-hmm. And Peggy was devoted to recognizing and supporting her art. There's, one of the most moving rooms in her palazzo is dedicated to Beguine's work. And that sense of like, not just taking care of your kid or loving your kid, but respecting your kid and kind of being open-nerved in appreciating what your child can see in the world that you can't yourself see. I think there was a kind of deep regard that was central to Rebecca's experience of mothering and that she also saw in Peggy and to the point of historical fiction rather than biography, like built into her vision of Peggy's character in a really beautiful way, that kind of paying attention to the world, being invested in a vocation, that these aren't stances that kind of have to draw you away from mothering. They can be part of the work of mothering and kind of linked to the experience of mothering in these tremendous ways.
Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, too, I think she was such a poet of girlhood. I mean, I've written a lot of books about girls and girlhood, and it was something we talked about so much. And so when I talked to Ada in the green room, I said, I feel like I've seen your growth through. Rebecca used to post these beautiful photographs of Ada on Instagram and about, and about her art and it was just, you could see how important she thought girlhood was, and to be heard and seen and listened to, and to have a mother that attends to that and creates a space for that and is interested, and she always seemed so interested, and I think that is really one of the many things that makes her a great writer, is that acuity about that. And I think one of the things in Peggy that's so interesting to me is her worry for her sisters, and when her sister is pregnant. I won't get the details to spoil the book, but like you just feel this sort of ache. I feel like, just knowing Rebecca, I feel like this kind of ache coming from her through that. So that all feels really true and real.
Should we open it up to the audience? I believe microphones will be passed around. Don't be shy. I know that first question.
They will come to you. There's somebody in the back, there's people in the middle to the back, and anyone in the front, just raise your hand and we'll come to you if you have a question. The floor is open. Camilla.
Hi, I was wondering if anyone could shed some light on the cover design for Peggy.
Yes. Do you like it? It was hard because Rebecca wasn't with us, and one thing that every publisher tries to do is represent the author's vision, what's in the book, and their own ideas about a cover, and then try to depict that in a way that might appeal to readers. And sometimes we do that in a more literal way, and sometimes it's more metaphorical. We went through a lot of covers, and at first our instinct was to have an actual image of Peggy Guggenheim on the cover. And there's some incredible photographs of her, many of them well known. But those tended to feel more like biography. They didn't feel like Rebecca. And after many attempts of trying to novelize that approach, I think we all agreed we needed to step away from that, because we were too focused on Peggy Guggenheim, the figure, and not focused enough on Rebecca Godfrey, the writer, and her own vision, which is evident in the pages. So we started over and thought maybe we should do something that is more metaphorical, something that leans into beauty, color, something that perhaps points to the trends of art that she was involved with, but that we didn't want to be too literal in that. Surrealism was really important to her and plays a role in the book, and we sort of tried that, but that went again, it became too literal. So we wanted something that kind of represented some of the ideals of the book and the way Rebecca was telling us in the book how she thinks about Peggy. And Lynn Buckley, who's a designer and an artist, painted this and showed it to us, and we loved it, and we shared it with everyone, and we felt this was the way to go. So it was a you know, there are many steps to that process. Yeah.
And I also love, Herb and I were talking about this just before the event, but that the Rebecca's handwriting is on here.
That's
the
right.
novels,
Yes.
her handwriting, and
Yeah.
Peggy is a kind of, I guess, a reconstruction of what
Yes.
of what her handwriting
Through
is.
her handwritten pages, Christy sent us copies of those pages, and there were examples of her writing Peggy, and then there were other examples of you know, other letters in the alphabet. So this is a recreation of how she wrote Peggy in some of her notebooks, and a novel as well. Yeah.
Anyone else? Questions? Here you go.
Hi. So Leslie, you mentioned how you were channeling Rebecca's voice for this project, and I was just curious, going forward and working on your own solo projects, if you feel like that's going to influence your writing style, or whether it was something that was more like contained within this work.
What a great question. I don't know if I totally know the answer yet, but I do know that one of the things I was conscious of as a difference maybe between some of my stylistic tendencies and Rebecca's, I mean, there are a few, like ranging from the nitty gritty, like Rebecca was a little more addicted to semicolons, like I'm a little more addicted to M dashes, like, you know, we have our different tics or whatever, and some of that I would try to be like, you know, try to get rid of some of my M dashes for the sake of not like polluting Rebecca's book with too many M dashes. So I think there are a few things like that where I'm like, okay, certain kinds of pushing back against my own tics or crutches that I think might stay with me. But there were also some deeper things like Rebecca was pretty ruthlessly unsentimental in how she wrote. Like there's a crispness to her prose. There's a refusal to kind of indulge in too much easy sentiment. And I mean, I don't want to think of myself as like hugely sentimental or an indulger, but I do think I sometimes veer towards that. Like I want to have like the great swelling epiphanic moment before the white space. And Rebecca was really a graceful and nimble kind of deflector of some of those like big swelling mushy energies. And so I think there was a way that like what I want to say is that I feel like there was a kind of a way that she taught me about edges, or that spending a lot of time with her voice on the page taught me about a certain kind of angular sharpness that I was quite compelled by and felt I had something to learn from. So that education and edges. I guess I can say I hope it plays out. Or I mean, all these things that if once you get too intentional about them, they lose their duende or whatever. But I do think some of that lives in me from that kind of intense time of communion with her work.
It's so funny that you say that, because I feel that though I did not do what you did, Under the Bridge, I feel like she does the same thing in that, where it's often in the voice of these teenage girls. She's sort of ventriloquizing, and it's sort of their feeling about this age, and everything feels big and epic and important, and then she will cut the legs out from under it at the end of it, and you will be brought back down to earth. And it's something that I definitely feel like got under my skin, and that's the thing with great writers, is sort of like Didion, etc. They're contagious. They're a little bit, and you find yourself you have to be careful.
Anyone else? Please raise your hand if you have another question. Anybody?
Megan, I have one question for you. Could you tell us the experience of when you got the book and your experience of reading it? Where were you, and how did you first read Peggy?
I read it. Oh, it was several months ago now, with a galley, and I have to say it took me a while. I had it sitting there, and there is something emotional. I'm sure you felt it 100 times over. Of to read it then would be the last bit that I would have of Rebecca's writing that I hadn't read. So there was something very hard about it, and I wanted to savor it, and I read it very slowly, and until I couldn't read it slowly any longer, because I mean, I just think you did a majestic job, because I too could not have told what portions you wrote and she did, but it was it did feel it was a deeply emotional experience, and it felt like this great gift, because the book had lived with her for so long and had meant so much to her, and her determination, which I've since learned about, to make sure that it was finished. There was something so satisfying as we read it to get to complete that circle for her that you helped us complete, and that you helped too. So I felt, very grateful.
Thank you. Well, Leslie, Megan, thank you so much for being here tonight, and thank you all of you.
My goodness. Thank you all so much for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Just wonderful tribute. I hope everybody grabs a copy of the book from the bookstore and enjoys a fantastic read over the next several days. Leslie has beautifully signed the books that are available, so enjoy. If you are here for the private reception, we'll be just sort of doing the list on the way up the stairs, starting immediately. So thank you all so much for coming. Have a wonderful night. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Could you all take a photo on stage?
Oh, sure.
Gorgeous. Yeah.
If you would, that might be great. Yeah. I don't want to miss it.